In this scenario is a 12-mark question that switched up the order a bit. But yeah, discuss the problems for the Ivory Coast. The problems for the Ivory Coast of dependency on cocoa for a large proportion of their exports. I refer to figure 2 in your answer. So I'm probably now going to have a read of this extract. And let's have a quick look at figure 2. So Ivory Coast exports, relative share of main products 2016. So cocoa and cocoa products is around 54% of their exports. So looking at this, and even back to when I was reading the question, the main thing that was in my mind, what does this show? How does this link to in the spec? What do we learn about this concept? Of course, it is, I believe it's 4.3.2, and it's one of the first spec points there. And this is, of course, PPD. What is PPD? Primary product dependency. It's where developing economies rely heavily on the export of raw commodities such as cocoa beans, such as things like rice, for example. And of course, with 54% of Ivory Coast's exports being cocoa beans, it really shows a high degree of primary product dependency. But back to the question, and I think it's a really good one. 100% will be using this bit of application for the 54% as it really does add to the question. Okay, so let's get started with this first paragraph. So first thing first, like I said, I want to pretty much say the problem for Ivory Coast of dependency on cocoa for a large proportion of their exports is that it leads to primary product dependency. And like we said, the extract says something like 40%, 54% of Ivory Coast's exports are cocoa and associated things. Okay, but now, like I said, why is primary product dependency an issue? This therefore means that, of course, like we mentioned, and the extract also mentions, is that Ivory Coast are extremely exposed to price fluctuations of cocoa. Okay, so my next chain of analysis, so I've said they're extremely exposed to fluctuations in the price of cocoa. I'm now going to mention that if the price of cocoa falls, Ivory Coast, since 54% of the economy, its exports are built up of cocoa, it means that export revenue is massively going to decrease if the world price of cocoa falls. I'm now going to link this to the spec point of 4.1.4, which is terms of trade. This means Ivory Coast's terms of trade will deteriorate. Now, why is that important? So really simple way I sometimes tell my students to try the what terms of trade is how many imports a country can buy with its exports. So what I mean by deteriorating their terms of trade, as the price of cocoa is now lower, this therefore means when Ivory Coast are exporting cocoa, they are receiving a lower price for it. They're receiving less export revenue. This therefore means they now have less money to spend on imports since they gained less export revenue. So the main problem with the deteriorating terms of trade, it means that a country will be able to import less goods, such as specialist capital, such as machinery. Therefore, that can of course hurt the long-run prospects, the LRAS of a country, as for example, it's going to affect their productivity as they won't be able to import maybe the newest high-tech machinery. So that's how I would write my first paragraph. So just finishing it off with, meaning Ivory Coast can afford to import fewer goods, e.g. high-tech machinery, limiting the development in the country. But now let's move on to the evaluation stage of this paragraph. First things first, I am actually going to use a point that we used earlier, which is about a paragraph point for our earlier question, which is about how in evaluation, I'm going to say this depends on the degree of diversification. Since, of course, and this is a really good bit here, we can use the bits of application again. Since, yes, 54% of the economy is built off cocoa, but then we have oil, rubber, gold, other. And of course, we can use that saying that this will therefore mean that as they are slightly diversified, like for example, 11% is oil, 7% is rubber, it reduces Ivory Coast's vulnerability to these fluctuations, as when the price of cocoa beans falls, the price of oil may not fall, thus meaning that the economy's exports still remain relatively stable. So there's lots of evaluation points here. A really good one is government intervention. So of course we're talking about macro here, but if you think about the side of things which is government subsidies and subsidizing these firms, you could mention that maybe during the times where there's fluctuations, where there's troughs, where there's drops in the price of cocoa, that the government could intervene, they could subsidize these firms, provide stabilization schemes for these farmers, thus meaning the effect on the overall economy, the effect on AD as a whole won't be as bad as, for example, they now could patch up that lost export revenue with some government funding, meaning that they can still afford to import the same amount of goods, thus meaning the long-run effects on things like productivity and long-run growth will not be felt. And then a classic one with the whole of development is always, whenever we're thinking about primary product dependency, is value added. So with cocoa, I believe it mentions it somewhere in the extract as well. Instead of just exporting the cocoa, what these farmers can start doing is actually becoming the next stage in the process, moving forward within the production process. So they can make the cocoa, but then they can also make the chocolate bar, for example. So process the cocoa, make the chocolate bar, and that value added will lead them to be much less affected, much less vulnerable to these fluctuations. So you could 100% say it depends on the time frame and depends how these price fluctuations force these cocoa farmers to react and to adapt to the new climate, the new economic climates. And there's even more here. So even with regards to the drop in the price of cocoa, we said there's a 1/3 drop in price in 2017, I believe. But you could also say how in evaluation, this depends on the degree to which cocoa prices fall, as that could be a massive outlier, where that could be the first time cocoa prices have dropped so significantly. And usually they may only drop a few percentage points or fluctuate a few percentage points. So it really does depend on how much these prices do fluctuate in reality. Okay, so moving on to the second point. This point is very much linked with, it's a similar point that we'd say as a negative for inflation. So if you think about a negative of inflation with regards to how it affects FDI, what would you say? And what I would say is, and what would be said on the You Do Econ website, on the flashcards, but I would say one of the main negatives with regards to FDI is uncertainty. So when there's unstable or high rates of inflation, it usually reduces the degree or the amount of FDI within a country. Why? Since foreign investors are uncertain about the economic climate within the country, therefore uncertain for whether the investment will go well or go poor. So they usually reduce the degree to which they invest. Quite a similar problem is here. So with regards to the dependency, obviously the primary product dependency and the fluctuations in the price of cocoa, it will therefore lead to a massive degree of instability or uncertainty, which means domestic firms within Ivory Coast are less likely to invest. And it's just like we saw in the UK post-Brexit, where business confidence fell massively, and more importantly, animal spirits and business investment fell massively within the UK due to the uncertain economic climate in the future. And this, of course, was exacerbated or made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic. But back to the actual question. So more uncertainty, more instability due to the fluctuations in the price of copper is, of course, going to lead to less certainty for firms, meaning that they're going to invest less. Firms are going to invest less, meaning that there's going to be less investment into capital. If there's less investment into capital, like tractors, specialist machinery, it's of course going to affect things like LRAS, the economic growth of the country, and just like things like development. And of course, I'd probably go into a bit of detail about productivity there. So when I'm talking about worsen capital, it's going to worsen the productivity, then develop a bit of a chain of analysis with regards to that. So yeah, that's pretty much my chain of analysis there. I would just pretty much conclude it with talking about how both LRAS and AD decrease. Okay, so give most evaluation that. So I give about 5 evaluation points for the first paragraph, so you can just use a few that are relevant in this paragraph as well. But yeah, that's pretty much how I'd answer this 12-mark question. And yeah, let's keep going.